Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us, well, quite a stack of challenging sources today. It looks like a collection focusing on the evidence and arguments for the core claims of Christianity. These aren't exactly light reading, are they? Very dense, lots of citations. Looks almost like a legal case file sometimes.
That's a good way to put it, actually. They are dense. And our job today isn't really to debate the beliefs themselves, right?
Yeah.
But more to map out how these arguments are constructed, to show you the structure of the case they're trying to build.
Exactly. We want to guide you through the architecture of the evidence presented here.
And that's key. These materials, with titles like Proof That Requires a Decision, they're functioning as apologetics, a formal defense. They're trying to take the discussion beyond just faith and ask, does the evidence around Jesus Christ, especially the resurrection, hold up to, let's say, a high standard of proof, historically and intellectual?
Okay, let's unpack this. So if you're building that kind of case, like a legal brief for something 2,000 years ago, where do you even begin?
You absolutely have to start with the documents, the evidence itself. Before you can even talk about what the New Testament claims, you first have to deal with its integrity as a historical document. So the sources spent a lot of time on the reliability, the textual accuracy of the Gospels, the epistles, all of it.
Makes sense. If the documents fall apart under scrutiny, the whole argument just kind of dissolves.
Precisely. The whole case rests on it at the foundational level.
Now, I noticed this section leans heavily on manuscript evidence. That sounds potentially very dry and academic. But the way they frame it seems quite pointed. They use this comparative approach, comparing the New Testament to other ancient texts.
Yeah, comparative textual criticism. And it's actually quite fascinating when you dig into it. They get very specific. Basically, you judge how well an ancient text survived by looking at two main things compared to other texts from that era.
Okay, what are those?
First, just the sheer number of copies that still exist today. How many manuscripts do we actually have? And second, the time gap. How much time passed between when the original was written and when our earliest surviving copy dates from?
Right, because the shorter the gap, the less time for mistakes or changes to creep in, presumably.
Exactly. And this is where the sources really highlight a difference. Think about major classical works. Plato, Tacitus, maybe Homer. We often have maybe, fewer than 20 copies, sometimes just a handful. And the time gap, it can be huge, like 800, 1,000, even 1,400 years between the original writing and the oldest copy we possess.
Wow. That's a long time for things to get lost or altered.
A very long time.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with the New Testament. The sources point out we have something like over 5,700 ancient Greek manuscripts, plus, thousands more early copies in other languages like Latin, Syriac. And critically, some of the earliest fragments we have date to within maybe 50 to 100 years, a couple of generations of the originals.
So decades, not centuries or millennia.
Right. A much, much shorter gap. And that massive number of copies combined with the short time gap is presented as really strong evidence that the text we have today is substantially what was originally written.
So the argument isn't perfection necessarily, but that if we use the same historical standards we apply to, say, Caesar's Gallic Wars or the Iliad,
which we generally trust as reasonably accurate historical documents,
then the New Testament is, by those standards, incredibly well preserved. Exceptionally so.
That's the point they hammer home. They argue the text itself, is solid enough historically to be taken seriously. Not just as scripture, but as an ancient document you can actually analyze historically. And that foundation lets them move to the next step.
Okay, so once they feel they've established the document's reliability, where does the argument go from there?
It shifts focus. From the document itself to the main subject described in the document, Jesus Christ.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Moving from ancient manuscripts to the person, to his character, his claims.
Exactly. This is often framed as an argument from internal consistency. The sources really emphasize the unique moral character and the extraordinary personal nature of Jesus as he's portrayed. And they connect this to his claims. The logic goes something like this. If Jesus was only a good moral teacher, his claims about being divine, having authority over nature, forgiving sins, those claims are problematic.
How so?
Well, if he wasn't actually divine, but claimed to be, then he wasn't just a good moral teacher. He was either, knowingly deceiving people, a liar, or he was tragically mistaken, perhaps delusional, a lunatic. C.S. Lewis famously framed this as the liar lunatic or Lord Trilemma. The sources argue you can't just pick good teacher and ignore the explicit claims of divinity. His character and his claims, they argue, have to be taken together.
That forces a choice, doesn't it? And this seems to be where miracles become crucial to the argument. The sources don't just list miracles, they seem to tackle the philosophical objections head-on.
They have to, because before you can even discuss whether Jesus, say, walked on water, you first have to address the underlying assumption some people have: philosophical naturalism. The idea that the laws of nature are a closed system, that supernatural intervention is impossible. Think David Hume.
Right, the argument that miracles, by definition, violate natural law and are therefore unbelievable.
Precisely. So that's why you see references, sometimes explicit ones, like to C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, addressing this very point. The argument structure is, first, establish the possibility of miracles. If a supernatural reality or a God exists who created natural law, then that entity logically could intervene or suspend those laws. Only after establishing that possibility can you then reasonably examine the specific historical evidence for whether such an intervention actually did occur. It's like clearing the philosophical ground first.
Okay, so they argue for the possibility, then use the testimony from those texts they've argued are reliable.
Exactly. To make the case for specific miracles actually happening, often linked to this, or maybe as a separate line of evidence, is prophecy.
Ah, right, fulfillment of prophecy.
Yes. The sources often list specific predictions from the Old Testament details about the Messiah's birth, life, death, even resurrection, and argue that these were uniquely fulfilled in Jesus centuries later. This is presented as evidence suggesting, a preordained plan or divine foreknowledge.
Okay, so let's recap the structure so far. We have arguments for, 1, the reliable transmission of the text itself. 2, the internal coherence of Jesus's character and his claims, including dealing with the issue of miracles and prophecy. And all of this seems to be building towards one central event, which feels like the absolute core of the whole case.
Unquestionably, the resurrection.
That's the linchpin.
Absolutely. Everything stands or falls on it. If you look at the sheer volume of material in these sources, the resurrection gets the most attention, the most detailed analysis. It's treated not just as a belief, but as a historical event, or maybe better, a historical hypothesis that needs to account for certain known facts.
Okay, so how do they structure the evidence specifically for the resurrection? It seems pivotal.
They generally organize it around 3 core lines of reasoning, 3 key pieces of evidence that, they argue, point compellingly towards the resurrection as the best explanation.
What's the first one?
The first is simply the empty tomb. It's presented as a basic historical fact. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried in a known tomb, and a few days later, that tomb was empty. His body was gone. The sources then spend considerable effort examining and attempting to refute the alternative explanations.
Like what?
Well, did the disciples steal the body? Seems unlikely given their subsequent behavior. Did the authorities, Roman or Jewish, move the body? If so, why didn't they produce it later to stop the resurrection claims? Did the women just go to the wrong tomb in the confusion? The authors argue systematically that each of these naturalistic explanations fails to adequately explain all the known facts, especially what happened next.
Which brings us to the second line of reasoning.
Exactly. The post-resurrection appearances. This focuses on the numerous accounts of the Gospels and epistles, where Jesus reportedly appeared alive again to various people. Not just to 1 or 2, but to individuals like Mary Magdalene, to small groups of disciples, even to larger crowds. Paul mentions an appearance to over 500 people at one time.
And how do they argue for the validity of these appearance accounts?
They treat them as eyewitness testimony, applying criteria used to assess witness credibility. They highlight the diversity of the witnesses, the different circumstances of the appearances, the fact that these accounts are found in multiple independent sources within the New Testament. They even point to seemingly embarrassing details, like the first witnesses being women, whose testimony wasn't highly valued, then arguing these details actually lend credibility, as you wouldn't invent them if you were making up a story.
Okay, so we have the empty tomb and multiple accounts of appearances. What's the third pillar?
The third, and arguably one of the most powerful from a psychological perspective, is the transformed lives of the disciples.
Ah, yes. Their change in behavior.
It's incredibly dramatic. You have this group of followers who, after the crucifixion, were completely devastated. They were hiding, scared for their lives. Their leader was dead. The movement seemed finished. Peter denied even knowing Jesus. And then very suddenly, these same people become incredibly bold, fearless even. They start proclaiming publicly that Jesus is risen, and they stick to that story even when faced with arrest, beatings, imprisonment, and ultimately, for most of them, violent execution.
That's a radical turnaround.
A complete 180. The sources argue forcefully that something extraordinary must have happened to cause such a profound and lasting transformation. They argue that simply seeing an empty tomb, or maybe having a hallucination or inventing a myth, just doesn't have the explanatory power to account for that level of conviction and willingness to suffer and die for their claim.
That point about their willingness to die for the claim, not just of belief, seems crucial. It connects back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of applying a legal standard. The sources actually say this evidence should be tested against the rules of evidence administered in courts of justice. That's quite a claim.
It is, and it's a recurring theme. They are essentially inviting the reader, or you, the listener, to put on a juror's hat. They're invoking principles used in legal fact-finding. For instance, the weight given to multiple independent witnesses whose accounts corroborate a central event, even if details differ slightly. Or the principle that conspiracies involving many people are incredibly hard to maintain over time, especially under intense pressure or the threat of death. Yeah. If the resurrection was a lie the disciples concocted, would they all have maintained that lie to their graves, often through torture?
So the argument is, if you took this combination of evidence, the unexplained empty tomb, the multiple eyewitness accounts of appearances, the radical and sustained transformation of the witnesses proven by their suffering into a courtroom,
they argue it would meet or even exceed the burden of proof typically required to establish a historical fact beyond a reasonable doubt.
That really frames the whole thing in a very specific, almost forensic way. It pushes it beyond just religious belief into the realm of historical investigation using a standard we recognize.
Precisely. It aims to make it an intellectual inquiry, not just an emotional one.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the structure of these arguments, starting with the text's reliability, moving through the person of Christ, his character, claims, miracles, prophecy, and culminating in this detailed, multi-pronged case for the resurrection, even framed using legal standards.
So what does this all mean? Where does that leave us? Well, it means these sources, this whole body of literature, isn't just presenting information, it's building a case. It's structured very intentionally, combining historical, textual, logical, and testimonial evidence to offer what the authors believe is a solid intellectual foundation for Christian belief.
Which loops right back to that challenging title, Proof That Requires a Decision. We've spent our time exploring the proofs, how they're built, the evidence used, the logic applied.
And so the provocative thought we want to leave you with is tied directly to that title. Having seen the structure of the argument, the question becomes, if, hypothetically, one were to find this case compelling, if one concluded that the evidence presented does meet a high historical standard, maybe even that courtroom standard, what decision, personal or intellectual, would logically follow from accepting these historical claims as robustly true?
A question that shifts the focus entirely from analyzing the past to considering the present. That really was a deep dive. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling, well, quite a stack of materials. Really dense stuff.
Yeah, definitely dense.
And it's all focused on the evidence, the arguments supporting the core claims of Christianity.
That's right. It's a deep dive into Christian apologetics, essentially.
Exactly. And these sources, I mean, looking at titles like, what was it, Proof That Requires a Decision, they're not exactly light reading. They feel more like intellectual briefs.
Very much so. They function as a structured defense. You see a lot of historical points, textual analysis, logical reasoning. It's all in there.
So our goal today isn't to, agree or disagree, but to map it out, understand the structure, how these arguments are built.
Precisely. The aim seems to be building a cumulative case, asking if the evidence, especially around Jesus Christ and, crucially, the resurrection, meets a certain standard of proof. A high standard, they'd argue.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you're building a case like that, a formal defense, where's the starting point, logically?
Well, you absolutely have to start with the documents, the source material.
The New Testament texts.
Exactly. The Gospels, the epistles. Before you even get to what they say, the argument in these sources is you first need to ask, are these documents reliable? Can we trust them as historical accounts?
Right. Because if the foundational texts are shaky,
then the whole structure built on top of them is shaky too. It collapses.
Yeah.
So establishing textual integrity is step one.
I did notice a significant chunk of the material focuses on manuscript evidence, but I mean, these are ancient documents. Aren't there always debates about who wrote them, when, how accurately they were copied? How do these sources handle that?
They tackle it directly, often using comparative analysis.
Comparing to what?
To other ancient writings. Things like, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Caesar's Gallic Wars.
Yeah.
Works we generally accept as historically transmitted.
Okay.
And the core argument presented is that the New Testament actually fares, well, remarkably well in this comparison. Sometimes, they argue, much better.
Better in what sense?
In two main ways they highlight. First, the sheer number of manuscript copies that have survived. We're talking thousands, in whole or in part.
Okay, volume. What's the second?
The time gap. The interval between when the original texts were likely written, say, mid to late 1st century,
Right.
and the dates of our earliest surviving copies. They argue that this gap is significantly smaller for the New Testament than for many major classical works.
Wait, hang on. So the claim is, just on a purely textual transmission basis, we have more and earlier copies of the New Testament than, say, Plato's Dialogues or Homer's Iliad.
That's precisely the argument laid out in these sources, yeah. It's often presented as a cornerstone for why the NT should be taken seriously as a historical document, not just a religious one.
That's quite a claim. It feels almost counterintuitive given how foundational those other texts are in Western thought.
It is a bold claim, and that's why it's usually presented early on. The goal is to establish that these writings deserve the same, if not more, historical scrutiny as other ancient texts, and that when you apply that scrutiny, they hold up surprisingly well in terms of textual preservation.
Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, they establish the documents have a strong textual basis. Where does the argument go next? From the paper to the person?
Exactly. The focus shifts from the reliability of the text to the content of the text, specifically the person at its center, Jesus.
And here's where it gets really interesting. It seems like they bring in arguments about his character, his nature.
Yes, that's a distinct line of reasoning. They analyze the character of Jesus as depicted in the Gospels, his teachings, his actions, his claims about himself.
And the argument is?
The argument, essentially, is that the portrait presented is internally coherent and morally compelling. They often explore the idea that his character makes options like him being a liar or a lunatic seem less plausible. It's an argument from internal consistency and moral impact.
And this connects to miracles, right? I saw references there too.
Absolutely. Miracles are crucial to the narrative. And they don't just assume miracles are possible. There's often a section addressing the philosophical question first.
Right. I remember seeing C.S. Lewis mention miracles, a preliminary study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's brought in to tackle the objection, can miracles even happen?
Yeah.
The idea is to establish the possibility of supernatural intervention before arguing for specific instances.
Makes sense. Address the philosophical hurdle first.
Right. And alongside miracles, there's also often a focus on prophecy.
Old Testament prophecy.
Yes. Connecting events in Jesus' life, his birth, ministry, death, back to passages in the Hebrew Bible written centuries earlier. The argument is that these fulfillments suggest, well, divine foresight or planning.
Okay, so we have the text's reliability, Jesus's character and claims, the possibility of miracles, the argument from prophecy. It feels like these are all building blocks.
They are. They're presented as converging lines of evidence, all pointing towards the central decisive event.
Which has to be the resurrection.
Without a doubt. That's the linchpin. If the resurrection happened as described, it validates everything else, the claims, the character, the miracles. If it didn't, the whole structure arguably crumbles.
And the sources dedicate a lot of attention here, right? Analyzing different aspects of it.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the most detailed arguments are usually marshaled. You see works focusing just on the evidence for the resurrection, addressing counterarguments, analyzing the accounts.
I recall the materials seemed to organize the evidence quite clearly around this. What were the main pillars they used to support the resurrection claim?
They generally focus on three core lines of historical reasoning, things they argue need explanation.
Okay, what's the first?
First, the empty tomb. This is presented as a basic historical fact, agreed upon by many, even critical scholars, that the tomb where Jesus was buried was found empty shortly after. The debate then becomes why it was empty.
Right, and they address the alternative explanations, like the body being stolen or moved.
Yes, they systematically try to refute those non-supernatural explanations, arguing they don't fit all the known facts.
Okay, empty tomb. What's number two?
The post-resurrection appearances. This moves beyond the empty tomb to positive claims that Jesus was seen alive afterwards.
By whom?
By numerous people, according to the accounts. Individuals like Mary Magdalene, Peter, then the apostles as a group, other disciples, and even one passage mentions a crowd of over 500 people at once.
Wow, 500?
Yeah. The argument here focuses on the nature and number of these alleged appearances. Were they hallucinations?
Yeah.
Legends? They analyze the testimony.
Okay. Empty tomb appearances. What's the third pillar?
This one is often presented as psychologically very powerful, the transformed lives of the disciples.
How so?
Well, you look at the state of the disciples immediately after the crucifixion. They were scattered, terrified, hiding, disillusioned. Their leader was dead.
Right, makes sense.
But then, very shortly after, these same people completely change. They start boldly proclaiming Jesus is risen, facing persecution, imprisonment, torture, and ultimately, for most of them, violent death. All for this message.
So the argument is, what could cause such a radical 180-degree turn from fear to fearlessness?
Exactly. The claim is that only a genuine encounter with the risen Christ could plausibly explain such a dramatic and lasting transformation in so many people. Not just belief, but conviction strong enough to die for.
That connects back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea of a rigorous standard. I remember a really striking detail about applying legal standards.
Yes. That's a fascinating rhetorical and argumentative strategy used in some of these sources.
Tell me more about that.
They explicitly suggest testing the evidence, particularly the eyewitness accounts in the Gospels, against the kind of rules of evidence administered in courts of justice.
Like a courtroom trial for a historical event.
Kind of, yeah. The implication is that the evidence for the resurrection, the empty tomb, the multiple eyewitness accounts of appearances, the transformed lives, is so strong that if presented in a modern legal setting, it would meet or even exceed the standard of proof required for a verdict.
That's putting a very high bar on it, applying a judicial standard.
It is. It's a way of framing the historical inquiry to suggest objectivity and rigor. It invites you, the reader or listener, to act like a juror, weighing the evidence presented.
So if we try to, connect this all to the bigger picture, what's the ultimate point? What are these sources trying to achieve by building this case layer by layer?
So what does this all mean? It means the structure is deliberate. It's not just a collection of interesting facts. It's building an argument, step by step. Are the documents reliable? Is the central figure credible? Did the key event, the resurrection, actually happen based on the evidence?
It's designed to provide an intellectual framework, a justification for belief. Not just have faith, but here's why it's reasonable to believe.
Precisely. It aims to satisfy the mind as well as the heart, you could say.
And that brings us back to that title, Proof That Requires a Decision. We've sort of mapped out the proofs as they're presented, the textual, the historical, the testimonial evidence.
Which leads directly to the provocative element right there in the title.
The implication seems pretty clear.
If this case, presented with this claimed level of rigor, arguing it meets even judicial standards, if you were to find that case compelling, if you concluded it was historically robust,
Then what?
then the question these authors pose, implicitly or explicitly, is, what decision did that conclusion demand? What follows logically from accepting that Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead? It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's framed as something requiring a personal response.
A powerful thought to leave things on, definitely clarifies the structure and the challenge these materials present. A really insightful deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with, a really challenging body of work.
It's quite a stack, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. We've got this dense collection of sources. It's a mix, really. Scholarly citations, biblical analysis, historical arguments, all seemingly working together to build this organized intellectual case for the core claims of Christianity.
Right. A defense, you could say.
Yeah, a defense. And these materials, you often see them framed with phrases like proof that requires a decision.
That's a key theme, definitely. It signals the intent.
It does. It feels like they aren't just asking for belief. They're trying to prompt some kind of intellectual reckoning.
Forcing the issue, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So our mission today isn't to agree or disagree, but to really look at the structure. How is this case built? What are the pillars they're relying on?
And importantly, what standard of proof are they claiming to meet? Especially when it comes to Jesus Christ's life and, critically, the resurrection claims.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, I think it's important to see, right from the get-go, how this body of work frames itself. It's presented as an appeal to reason.
Okay.
They're essentially saying, look, before we even get to faith, let's talk history, let's talk reliability.
Starting with the documents themselves.
Precisely. You have to establish that first.
So that brings us straight into, let's call it part one.
Yeah.
The textual foundation, getting into the historical reliability of the New Testament writings. The Gospels, the epistles.
Makes sense. If your source documents are flawed or untrustworthy, any historical claim built on them is shaky at best.
Absolutely. You can't prove anything if the evidence itself is unreliable.
So the core argument they lean on here is comparative textual criticism.
Okay, explain that a bit.
Well, the sources spend a lot of time demonstrating that the documents recording New Testament events, they actually meet, and they argue, often exceed the standards we normally apply to other ancient historical texts we accept.
Right. So let's get specific here because this is where the details matter. What kind of concrete points do these sources make to argue the New Testament texts are more reliable than, say, works by Plato or Caesar?
Okay, so what's fascinating is when they put the numbers side by side and the timeline. Think about most widely accepted classical works, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Plato, Homer. We often base our knowledge on maybe a few dozen manuscripts, sometimes fewer.
Right, I've heard this point before.
And crucially, those copies we do have, they're typically separated from when the original was actually written by like 800, sometimes 1,000 years. A huge gap.
A massive gap, yet we generally trust those texts for our understanding of history.
We do, implicitly. So the sources contrast this sharply with the New Testament.
Okay.
They point to evidence showing we possess thousands of Greek manuscripts alone.
Some counts go over 5,800.
Wow, thousands compared to dozens. That's
significant.
It is. And maybe even more importantly, the time gap shrinks dramatically. Between the original writings and our earliest substantial copies, it's often down to decades, maybe a century or two in some cases, but not the vast gulf you see elsewhere.
Decades, not centuries.
Exactly. Which allows for a much higher degree of confidence, they argue, in reconstructing what the original text actually said.
So the implication they're pushing is, sort of, if we accept Plato based on relatively thin, much later evidence, then how can we just dismiss the New Testament, which seems to offer, well, vastly more robust and earlier textual evidence? Is that the core idea?
That's the strategic move.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The sheer number of copies and how early they date lets scholars cross-reference, compare, identify variations, and get much closer, theoretically, to the original wording.
Okay.
It's a level of textual verification that's just not available for most other ancient documents.
So they have to establish the integrity of the messenger, the document itself, before they even get to the, let's be honest, pretty unbelievable claims within the document.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
If the text is unreliable, riddled with errors from centuries of copying, the whole case just falls apart right there.
Right. That makes complete sense. Establish the document's credibility first. Okay, so once they feel they've established the texts as historically sound, or at least comparatively sound, where do they go next?
Well, then the focus shifts, naturally, away from the ink and the parchment.
And on to the person described.
Onto the person, yes. So part 2, you could say, is about the character and the specific claims of Christ himself.
Okay.
Here, the sources pivot. They start using more of an internal argument, often focusing on integrity.
How so?
They spend time analyzing the moral character, the teachings, the personal nature of Jesus as depicted in those texts.
Right.
And the question becomes something like, how could someone who taught such profound moral lessons, things we still wrestle with 2,000 years later, and who seem to live with such integrity, how could that same person be simultaneously making up the most world-altering claims imaginable, either deceiving people or perhaps deceived himself?
So it's kind of like they're asking you to consider the source, but the source person. If the claims are false, then Jesus must have been fundamentally either a liar or mad, right?
That's often how it's framed, yes.
Yeah.
The liar, lunatic, or Lord Trilemma sometimes comes up.
But if his character seems sound, if it holds up under scrutiny, then maybe, just maybe, the radical nature of his claims deserves more weight.
That's the line of reasoning they pursue. And tied directly to those radical claims is, of course, the whole issue of miracles.
Yes, miracles, always a sticking point for a modern scientific mindset.
Absolutely. And the sources know this. They anticipate that resistance. That's why you see specific references to works trying to address this head on, like C.S. Lewis on miracles, for instance.
So how do they tackle that? Do they try to prove miracles scientifically?
Not exactly scientifically, but philosophically or logically. The argument often goes like this. If you accept the possibility of a God who created the universe in the first place.
Okay. Like a first cause, an external intelligence.
Right. If such a being exists, is it then illogical to think that this being could intervene within the natural laws he established? A miracle, in that view, isn't necessarily illogical or impossible. It's just an event outside the normal, everyday operation of the system, initiated by the system's creator.
I see. So It's presented as potentially logical if you grant the premise of a supernatural creator. It shifts the debate slightly.
It does. It reframes it from impossible to possible within a certain worldview.
Okay. And then under the same sort of heading, looking at Christ's claims, we also see arguments about prophecy, right?
Yes, that's another pillar they bring in before getting to the main event, so to speak.
The main event being the resurrection, I assume.
Exactly. But before that, they highlight instances where events in Jesus' life, details like his birthplace, the way he died, specific actions seem to align precisely with prophecies in the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament.
Texts written centuries earlier.
Centuries earlier, yes. And this alignment is presented not as mere coincidence, but as evidence suggesting a deliberate pattern. Maybe divine orchestration.
Okay, so we have textual reliability, then character and claims, including miracles and prophecy.
Yeah.
It feels like this is all building towards something specific.
It absolutely is. All of these threads, the reliable text, the unique character, the possibility of miracles, the fulfilled prophecies, they all converge on and lead into the central argument, the absolute focus of this entire body of work.
Which is undeniably the resurrection.
Or resurrection, yes. It's the linchpin. The sources make it crystal clear. If this central historical claim fails, the whole structure collapses. Everything else becomes secondary.
But conversely, if the resurrection does hold up under scrutiny,
then all the preceding evidence, the texts, the character, the prophecies, suddenly gets amplified.
Yeah.
It's exponentially reinforced.
Okay. This section, looking through the materials, it definitely seems the most detailed. Lots of references to works just on the resurrection evidence, tackling alternative theories.
It's heavily weighted, for sure. They know this is where the core claim rests.
So how do they organize this mountain of evidence for someone trying to follow the argument? What's the structure?
They generally break it down into maybe 3 key lines of reasoning, each one requiring its own historical explanation if you don't accept the resurrection.
Okay, line 1.
First, the empty tomb. The basic stark fact that the tomb where Jesus was buried was found empty.
Right.
They argue the location was known, it was guarded, and yet the body was gone. And critically, even hostile sources at the time didn't seem to dispute the emptiness of the tomb. They just offered different explanations for why it was empty, like the disciples stole the body.
So the empty tomb itself is presented as a kind of established historical fact, even if the reason is debated.
That's the claim. Then the second pillar, the post-resurrection appearances.
Okay.
And this isn't framed as just 1 or 2 people having a vision. The sources emphasize the accounts of Jesus appearing to many different people in different situations.
Like Mary Magdalene and the disciples.
Yes, individuals, small groups, but also large groups. There's the reference to him appearing to over 500 people at once.
Right. Paul mentions that.
He does. And the argument here is that the sheer number and variety of these reported appearances make explanations like mass hallucination or purely subjective experiences, well, less plausible.
Okay, empty tomb, appearances. What's the third line? This one always seems very powerful, narratively speaking.
It is. It's the transformed lives of the disciples.
Yes.
The shift, the radical shift. You had this group of followers who, right after the crucifixion, were completely demoralized. They were scared, scattered, hiding.
Understandably so. Their leader had just been executed.
Exactly. But then suddenly, just weeks later, these same people are out in public, boldly preaching that Jesus is risen. They're facing arrest, beatings, persecution, eventually even death.
And they refuse to back down. They stick to the story.
They stick to the story. The sources argue that this dramatic, sudden, and total psychological turnaround from abject fear to unwavering conviction, it needs a powerful explanation.
It can't just be explained by them deciding to, perpetuate a lie they knew was false. Especially when it cost them everything.
That's the challenge they pose. A simple lie or a shared delusion doesn't seem to account for the depth and persistence of that transformation. It demands some kind of extraordinary catalyst.
That shift from cowardice to conviction is definitely a compelling piece of the puzzle. But digging through these sources, what really struck me, what elevates their claim to rigor, is how they talk about evaluating this evidence. They bring in this amazing analogy.
You mean the legal standard?
Yes, the courtroom analogy. That detail really makes you sit up and take notice, doesn't it? It moves it beyond just, here's some history.
It's a really powerful rhetorical move, and I think it's key to why these materials often use words like proof or frame it as requiring a decision.
So what do they actually say? How do they connect it to legal standards?
They explicitly mention, in some of the cited works, testing the evidence, but particularly the accounts of the gospel writers, the evangelists, against the rules of evidence administered in courts of justice.
Wow. Okay, so they're not just saying, believe us. They're saying, put our witnesses on the stand, metaphorically speaking.
Exactly. Treat this like a trial. What does a court demand?
Well, you need credible witnesses, right? You look for corroboration between accounts, you scrutinize motives, you cross-examine the testimony, you look for contemporary or near-contemporary documentation.
Precisely. So by invoking this high, rigorous judicial standard, they're arguing that the historical claims surrounding the resurrection shouldn't just be waved away. They should be subjected to that same kind of tough scrutiny.
And the implication is, if the evidence holds up under that kind of cross-examination,
The implication is that if this evidence would be sufficient to establish a fact in a court of law, perhaps even convict someone in a high-stakes case, then it should be sufficient to establish this historical event as fact.
that fundamentally changes the frame for the reader, for the listener. You're not just reading some old stories. They're asking you to act like a juror.
That's exactly the position they want you in, sitting in judgment on the evidence presented.
Okay, so the structure seems designed to sort of intellectualize the path to belief. First, establish the documents are reliable, at least by historical standards.
Textual and historical validity first.
Then, build credibility around the central figure, his character, the plausibility of miracles within a theistic framework, the hints of prophecy.
Support the claims around the person.
And finally, bring it all home with the core claim, the resurrection, backed by these converging lines of evidence. The empty tomb, the multiple appearances, the transformed followers.
All presented as evidence robust enough to meet a demanding, even legal standard of proof.
Right. So we've traced the architecture of this case. We've seen the pillars. Textual reliability, Christ's character and claims, and the resurrection evidence aiming for a courtroom standard.
So what does this all mean? If we sort of zoom out and connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
it means this body of work isn't just making a fuzzy spiritual appeal. It's actively trying to move the whole discussion into the arena of historical investigation and logical argument.
They're laying out exhibits, presenting testimony, building a case file.
Exactly. Presenting a body of evidence that they clearly believe is intellectually solid, historically defensible, and importantly, resistant to easy alternative explanations.
Which brings us right back around, doesn't it, to that title idea. Proof that requires a decision.
We've looked at the structure of the proof they offer.
We have.
So the provocative thought, maybe for you listening, is to really consider that standard. They invoke that rigorous judicial standard. If you were the juror,
And you seriously weighed the evidence presented in materials like these and hypothetically concluded that it did meet that high bar, that the core claims were historically factual. What then? What personal, intellectual, maybe even life-altering decision would that kind of conclusion logically require you to confront?